Okay, we're going to talk about now presenting the results. So basically you want to think about this as if you are telling the story of the air pollution in the air and the sources of that air pollution. So we're going to talk about how you create and modify and export the reports and charts in TEISS. We're going to talk about how to structure your emissions inventory report and what to include in it. So basically, you want to give enough information in your emissions inventory so that a reviewer could duplicate the results. The basic idea is that if somebody else could follow the process that you use to get your data, to import it, they would basically come up with the exact same numbers. You want to include a summary up front. Even if you look at the emissions inventory report that Angelique put together, it is not extremely long. But you could see it has a lot of headers. So it has an executive summary, and that's for the people who don't have time or the interest, or really it's just not appropriate for them to read all 25 pages. And then it gets into these various sections that we'll talk about. You want to make sure that the people who need to understand the sources of air pollution can understand your report, and obviously, unless they have TEISS installed on their computer, they're not going to be able to see what you see. So the elements of what constitutes an emissions inventory report. Well, first of all, you have to talk about what year. Remember, we're basically talking about a snapshot in time of the emissions from all the different sources. So what year? 2008, 2011, 2013. The geographic area covered, so you might want to be kind of specific about that and talk about whether or not you're including a buffer zone and why, if there are particular sources of interest that caused you to have the buffer zone be 50 miles outside of the boundaries of the reservation. You need to talk about the pollutants that your emissions inventory report includes. So those are pollutants like the criteria pollutants, hazardous air pollutants, and for every section, for every point category, you're going to have to go through these different pollutants because it's important to know the different source types and what pollutants are coming from what. And it's important to understand what concerns there have been. If there's a concern about haze, for example, then you're going to want to discuss that and talk about the possible contributors to haze. You're going to want to have, for source categories, at least point and non-point source categories, and then depending upon what issues there are, you may have on-road category of sources, non-road, for example, if you've got snowmobiles or ATVers, you are going to want to include non-road as a category and talk about that. You want to talk about the data and where it came from, and you're going to want to include any assumptions. For example, the biggest assumption that we're all making, of course, is that the data that's in EPA's National Emissions Inventory database is QA'd and accurate. So that's a big assumption right there that needs to be specified. So again, have an executive summary where you just have an introduction and just summarize it, say this is the year covered, etc. Summary of the results. And if you take a look at the My Reservation EI, you could see that these are relatively small, just a paragraph and then a list of the pollutants covered and then results. Always it's easier to review things in tables. It's just easier to make sense of them than if you had it all just written out in text. So just a table describing the results. The summary doesn't have to be long. Several bullet points, including major issues and next steps. In terms of the body of your big emissions inventory report, you're going to want to include information about the reservation environment, the geographic area. You're going to want to talk about the weather, whether there's a predominant wind pattern, which would feed into what area you're covering. So if you're including a buffer zone, why that is, maybe because of the prevailing wind directions or major sources in the area. You're going to want to talk about whether or not any previous emissions inventories have been conducted, whether you're updating those, whether you're expanding the area perhaps, whether there were concerns in previous emissions inventories, and this is an emissions inventory being done as the next step recommended by a previous one. You're going to want to discuss possibly emissions inventories from the surrounding area. Basically why you're doing this, and just as an introduction. You are going to want to talk about whether or not, for example, you have any Title V sources within the buffer zone, what pollutants they emit, and you might want to highlight that. You're going to want to make sure that you include a write-up for each pollutant of interest under each section. So you would have a section on point sources, and then PM 2.5 emitted by point sources, and then a section on non-point sources, and then the PM 2.5 emitted by the non-point sources. You're going to want to make sure that you use your judgment in describing what you consider the next steps to be, whether there are plans for future emissions inventories, including gathering data. For example, if you saw that there were some sources that emitted a large proportion of some pollutants of concern, then you may want to go out and gather original data from them. And have that be as part of the plan in the recommendation section in the conclusion of this report. You're going to want to conclude with references and then appendices. And in the appendices, that's a good place to put, for example, the full TEISS reports that may just be too big to put in your 25-page emissions inventory report. You want to think about whether or not your area and any nearby areas, especially downwind areas, are in attainment or non-attainment for these different pollutants. So it's important to do a little bit of research on the surrounding areas. And also, especially when you get into next steps and the plans for future work, make sure at some point in the course of this workshop to contact your project officer and talk to them about what their expectations are, because different EPA regions expect different things, and it's important not to be blindsided. For example, if you don't think a particular source category is important and you leave it out of your emissions inventory, and then have them say that they think that's one of the most important things that should be included. So that's important also, is that you stay in contact with your project officer. So these are, in general, some of the headers that you might want to include. Keep in mind that the more section headers you have, the more formal your report looks, and also the easier it is to review. It's a lot easier to review when you've got a header and then one or two paragraphs, and a header and one or two paragraphs. Make sure to have a list of tables and a list of figures, because you probably will have a lot of those, and having a lot of tables and figures makes your report easy to review also. And then especially if you use a lot of abbreviations, make sure to include a list of those, especially for somebody like maybe on tribal council or somebody else who isn't familiar with the terminology, PM, filterable. If you have a list of abbreviations somewhere either at the very end or at the very beginning, that's helpful. keep in mind that TEISS does not write your report, unfortunately. There are some places, though, where you can copy from the TEISS text, and you can go into the field itself and select some text, and some of those fields can take a lot of text. So if you've extensively used the IPP or the QA/QC tabs where you describe what you've done, you can copy from that into the Word document. TEISS does export maps, which is very useful, and you can do that the fancy way or the easy way. Graphs and tables also, and you can use these in your report. Okay, so here is a map from the Confederated Tribes of Colville, Chris Ray's emissions inventory, and this was very easily produced in TEISS by selecting File and then Print. And in summary, make sure to include all the elements. Sometimes, unfortunately, reviewers just look and see, oh, did they have these headers? Great. Nobody who will be reviewing your emissions inventory, I'm sure, but it helps, again, to have the headers there that people expect to see, where they look for different parts of the information. Format the report to look good. Keep it simple. It doesn't have to be long. It could be less than 20 pages long. And remember to write to your audience and tell the story of the air pollution on your land.